The country is reaching a tipping point as the number of shootings between police and black men increase. We'll show you what local communities are doing to strike a balance between police presence and relations with the public on this edition of Equal Time. Welcome to the campus of San Jose State University in this edition of Equal Time. I'm your host, Journalism School Director Bob Rucker. Across the United States, scenes of police shootings are prompting protests by many people. Some say they're recognizing a pattern. Quinn Dang shows us what local communities are doing to voice their concerns regarding racial bias within the police force.
Students gathered at San Jose State on this day in May to march against the shootings between police officers and unarmed black men. Communities across the country are organizing to combat the high-profile cases across the U.S. Here at San Jose State University, the movement is well underway. In April, world-renowned social activist Angela Davis came to speak to students about a variety of social issues, including what she called a militarized police state.
But let me say that it actually is exciting to reflect on all of the changes that have happened over the last half century.
The lecture brought the support of many well-known social activists.
Every generation has an obligation to fight its struggles. And because of what Angela did in the 60s and 70s, this generation doesn't have to do that.
Social activism is an attempt to seek justice from outside of the justice system. But is there movement within the justice system to right these wrongs? At the San Jose Independent Police Auditor's Office, former Superior Court Judge Ladoris Cordell is working to flush out racial biases in the police force. She says bias exists within all people, including police officers.
There's explicit bias where people just are upfront, I hate you because of who you are. That's the explicit. And then there's the implicit. That's the kind of bias that's unconscious. You don't even know you have it. But as a result of what you do, even though you don't even realize it, there it is.
Despite the biases, the numbers in her annual report have found that out of all claims against San Jose police for misconduct due to racial bias, none were sustained. Cordell suggests that the most effective way to eliminate bias within policing is to allow complete transparency within police work. One way of doing that is the institution of worn body cameras, which the department plans on implementing in the coming years. Earlier this year, the department began testing mounted body cameras. It would take an estimated $1 million to fully equip SJPD staff, but no matter what social views people have of the police, nothing can really compare to seeing police work firsthand. So Equal Time went on a ride-along with a San Jose police veteran to find out what goes into the job of being a cop on the streets.
Okay.
To cut herself.
Where did you guys find her?
She'll flat out tell you. Well, she actually, it was a call that was pending.
Yeah, was she just walking around?
Now, when we come back, we'll continue our coverage from the front seat of a police cruiser to show you a day in the life of a San Jose police officer. Welcome back. We've seen what civilians have had to say about reported bias within policing, but what do police say about it? Right now, we're going to join Quinn Dang as he continues our coverage with one of San Jose's finest.
Officer Henry Duran is a 25-year veteran with the San Jose Police Department. He says for him, racial bias doesn't even enter the question when making a stop.
People feel like that you stopped me because I'm black, or you stopped me because I'm Mexican, or you stopped me, and a lot of times I didn't even know until I stopped you, what ethnicity you were.
But other officers say that race is just a matter of fact, and if it were able to be addressed more openly, it would make their jobs easier.
Do you think it's important, maybe, for us to know the race of the individual if we run a driver's license? Okay. Is your race on your driver's license? No.
Informants or suspects that have, told the officer, hey, this is predominantly a Mexican area, so if you see somebody of another race, that's probably going to be a good car stop because this area is known for drug activity and, drug sales. So if you see somebody come up and they're not Mexican and, you know what they're coming for because the only people that live here are Mexican.
This day, following Officer Duran, was filled with random events which ranged from routine traffic stops to trees toppling over a home. Not just for Officer Duran, but for all police officers, something happens every day.
All right? Okay. All right, but I do have to put handcuffs on you, all right? Okay. All right.
While we were patrolling around the city, Duran received a tip from a fellow officer regarding a lead to a recent burglary. We followed the lead, and it brought us to a homeless encampment just next to the freeway.
What are you gonna do?
How you doing? Hey, turn that camera off. No. You mean no? Hold on, y'all just picture in court. I'm the attorney. That's great. What's your name? We had a robbery the other day. I want to make sure it wasn't you. 326.
You don't like the camera?
89.
You can
Thank
just,
you, Megan. You can go back
yeah.
to
According to Officer Duran, California has the benefit of being less prone to racial bias within the police force.
I think that, like I was telling you earlier, that California is more progressive than some of the states in the Midwest. They're still a little bit, not caught up with as far as the diversity.
There's no doubt that police officers take a risk every time they go out on the streets. Officer Michael Johnson was ambushed at this apartment complex earlier this year by a man who called police to the residence. It's a grim reminder that anything can happen at any time. Officer Duran says that his goal at the end of every day is to just be able to go home.
That was Quinn Dang reporting. Now, when we come back, Equal Time correspondent Samantha Rogers will join us, leading a discussion about police use of body cameras. Welcome back to this edition of Equal Time. Today we're talking about police body cameras. Let's meet our guests.
Good morning, I'm Keith Plamondon with the Mountain View Police Department. I'm a lieutenant and I oversee the body-worn camera program.
And I am Sergeant Saul Jaeger with the Mountain View Police Department as well. I'm our public information officer and media relations contact.
Hi, my name is Jordan. I work loss prevention. I am also a criminal justice major.
Hi, my name is Dr. Will Armaline. I'm the director of the Human Rights Program and associate professor in justice studies at San Jose State University.
Hi, my name is Samantha Rogers, and I am the student reporter for this story.
We thank you all for being here today, and I'm glad you picked this topic because every time you turn on the news, today you can't miss seeing something from a police camera, either from their car or from what they're wearing or something. The first question, of course, is how do you feel about that? Media is just using it as great attraction video.
Go ahead, Saul.
You're right, and I think with the advent, even if you take a step back, the advent of and popularity of smartphones and cameras, they're everywhere, regardless of whether an officer is wearing it or it comes from a police vehicle or any other government vehicle. They're out there for people to videotape, and this goes all the way back to Rodney King days when there was actually videotape of an incident that had happened. So it's a little scary for police departments to realize that there's so many eyes out there. But it is an equalizer as well.
Why is it scary, though? I mean, I understand what you mean by all the eyes are on it, but there's nothing to hide. But we were talking before about the picture alone, the raw video, never tells the complete story unless you know the setup, what caused the situation. And so I would say to you, does that worry you, and is that what's scary about all of this?
Well, from my standpoint, the raw footage is probably the best because it's giving you the perspective that the officer is dealing with at the time, their perspective, what they're seeing, and then how they react to that. So we have our own footage of that incident, and we get to, with all the other cameras or cell phones or whatever that are out there, a lot of times we don't have access to that. So we're conducting an investigation. Now we get to bring our video into it to help with that. We also have the ability to control that, whether we're going to release it to the public. Certain videos, as you know, over time, when they get released to the media, they never play the whole footage or the whole incident, and we with our cameras or our footage, we'd be able to release that if we chose to release it based on the circumstances, and we'd be able to put the whole picture out front.
And we'll come back to the notion of whether the media has the right to have everything aired, and do you want it to have everything aired? But Will, let me ask you about this concept of this effort to show what the police are doing in real life. Does it trouble you that we're not necessarily telling the public or teaching your students the whole story?
Well, I think we've already made some significant points here. So I would join in saying that first of all, there are lots of different ways that this technology is currently being used and thought about being used across police departments across the country. So first of all, we don't have unanimity on how these technologies are going to be used, and that's really where, for those of us who are rights advocates and those of us who are scholars in the situation, have our concerns. And actually, our concerns are shared by the Department of Justice, and they actually did a study in 2013 looking at Los Angeles and Nevada, Los Angeles and Las Vegas, looking at pilot programs with cameras. And so they brought up a bunch of these, they shared a lot of these concerns along with the ACLU, not just of the rights concerns for the officers, but also of the public involved. So obviously there are all kinds of questions in terms of how is the data taken, where and how is the data stored, who has access to the videos and through what conduits. So in other words, does the DA control the release of that? Does the police auditor, in the cases where there are police auditors, do they have access to that video? Does the public have access to that video? What's to determine who gets recorded and under what sorts of situations? If I have a police officer come to my home to ask questions about whatever they happen to be asking me questions about, are they recording my home? Are they recording my private property? Are they recording my license plates? This opens up massive constitutional human rights questions that, frankly, whether or not this will be useful with respect to transparency, with respect to the rule of law, has a much more to do with how we create the policies around the technology and how it's going to be used, rather than the technology itself. The technology itself is a tool like anything else. It's not in itself a solution to anything. Exactly. Particularly because I want to remind us, why are we at the table today? We're not at the table today talking about police cameras because we just thought to talk about police cameras. We're at the table today talking about police cameras because we've witnessed over and over again the murder of unarmed, typically men of color, at the hands of law enforcement. And so I want us to really come back to that. And so the other concern here, just to sort of move the conversation forward, is that there is some concern that police cameras and the application of video or the recording of police practice really is not necessarily the answer, given that in many of these cases, we have video of young men being murdered in full violation of all of their constitutional rights, oftentimes without mention if there wasn't rebellion in the streets. And even when there was rebellion in the streets, and even if there was a grand jury process, there were no indictments filed. So there are many of us that are in the rights community who are wondering, will more videotaping of these incidents be of much concern? In other words, is this a solution on scope and on par with the problem? And I'd be prepared to talk more about that, but I don't want to monopolize our time.
I definitely want to get your reactions to what he said, but I want to give a chance to Jordan to jump in here. Your thoughts about these cameras for police?
Well, I think the cameras are great. I mean, for my job, when a police officer comes in and takes my report for the shoplift case, they do put their cameras on. So everything that the suspect says, we say, and the officer says is all on camera. So when the officer comes in, we give our side of the story. We let the officer know our policies and everything. So whatever we say is all on camera. Whatever the suspect says is on camera, and whatever the officer says is on camera, and it all gets turned into the district attorney's office.
All right, very good. Samantha, as a journalism student, convergence journalism here, you're taught how to shoot, how to go out to secure an interview, but you're also taught the proper ways of identifying yourself, and you know exactly what the camera needs to record. Right. You're trained for that. They're not necessarily trained for that. Correct. They're trained in other areas that are very important. What have you found out about this topic?
So what I actually found out is where they place the body cameras can affect what kind of video that they get. So we actually have an example of a body camera that Lieutenant brought today that we can show, and he can explain how and where they are placed on the police officers. All
right, it looks like this. I'll hold it up so that you can see that on camera. It seems lightweight. It seems like it's easy to function. So if you will, go ahead and show us how that would be applied.
Well, this is just one of several cameras that are on the market. The camera that the Mountain View Police Department chose to purchase is the Taser Axon Flex. And normally this has a wire attached to a battery pack, but it allows the officer to mount it in several different positions on their body, usually up on the head, is probably the most desired place, because where your eyes go, the camera goes.
Okay.
Other mounting solutions are on the collar or on the epaulette mount of the outer worn vest carrier that the officers, some of the officers wear. And then with this, the purpose behind the camera is try to get what the eye is trying to see. It's not going to be perfect, and as Jordan mentioned earlier, a lot of this stuff mainly is from an evidentiary standpoint for us to gather evidence. And as Will was saying, it doesn't change anything that's going out there as far as if there's any human rights violations occurring, or if there's any misconduct on behalf of the officer. But what it does, it gives us our footage to have, and for us, for our investigations and stuff like that.
And what about recording audio? Does it have that capability?
It does. So this camera, it works on a 30-second loop. So before you actually activate the camera, the officer controls the camera, turning it on and turning it off, and a lot of that is set by department policy on when the camera will be used. But when you activate the camera, the prior 30 seconds, with the exception of the audio, is already picked up on the camera. So for example, if an officer is making a traffic stop, the 30 seconds prior to the activation, so whatever the violation that occurred in front of the officer, there's a chance that would be picked up on the video. And then when it's activated, then it just makes that part of the whole package.
The question that I had is, are these cameras always on, or do the officers have to know when to turn them on before something happens?
These cameras are solely activated by the officer. But as I mentioned earlier, the policy determines when the camera will be turned on. In situations where there may be an expectation of privacy in someone's home, that would be a situation that policy could dictate, where we would tell someone, hey, we're recording this situation. If we have a lawful right to be in there, maybe if it's a case of domestic violence or something, we would have the camera on. A burglary case, maybe there's no need to have that on if it's a cold situation and there's no suspect on scene, so we would control that.
Any other thoughts about that? Because I'm just curious about, you're giving the control to the officer as to when to record. When they go out to shoot a news story, they're told to go shoot everything in sight, bring it back, and we'll evaluate what is to be put out on the air. Why don't you do that in the police?
Well, there's some interesting things about the whole thing, and I like what you were saying, Professor, about this is a bigger issue than just the technology. And a lot of times we as society, especially in today's society, are so set on a quick fix to a problem. This is the problem of police violence and violence in the streets and use of force issues and things like that is a much bigger issue that's not going to be solved by a camera, solely by a camera. It's a one tool, and that was very well said. And again, a lot of times people forget that the vast majority of the time, police officers are not going into situations where we're dealing with violent suspects and things. A lot of what we do, we're talking to victims, we're talking to witnesses, we're talking to kids. We are going into private homes. We're doing things like that, and so the question is, this is all new territory for a police department. We're developing policies, and we're trying to be as transparent as possible, while at the same time not trying to ruin investigations, because ultimately we want to hold people accountable for their actions. So it's an interesting time right now, because we're trying to work with the DOJ, we're trying to work with privacy rights, civil rights issues and things, to find some sort of happy medium with the entire process.
They're open to it, Will, but there's pushback sometimes on how it's being used.
Well, just to do my job as a scholar and sort of speak a little more to the study that we referenced earlier. So the DOJ study, and they cite the ACLU in their study as well, having similar concerns. So that one of the questions, very specific questions in terms of policy, is similar to any of us who would wish to record each other, right? And typically doing so involuntarily is against the law. It's against one's constitutional protections. And so there's a few legal questions that come up with the use of these cameras. First so let's say I'm an officer and I'm about to record an interaction. Is there what's called two-way consent? So in other words, does this meet that same standard to where I have to not only inform you that you're being recorded, but do I actually have to ask your permission to be recorded? States across the country right now do not agree on this policy.
Exactly.
Other states are saying, okay, well, I don't have to ask your permission, but I do have to tell you that you're being recorded. Other states and jurisdictions are saying we don't have to tell you anything, we record as we wish. and then you can come after us for the data later. So one of the things the Department of Justice and the ACLU and others have said is, well, we clearly have to have a standard approach to this because of the constitutionality of the practice, not just to protect the police officers, but of course to protect the community who is potentially being surveilled beyond their constitutional protections. So I think, and I only offer that as one example, but it seems, again, from the studies that have been done on the practice so far, that there are many, many questions that are still being asked, and the suggestions of the Department of Justice, along with the other professionals they sort of spoke to, was that these really need to be heavily vetted and dealt with full transparency and conversation with the public before they're put into play.
And I think that's one of the concerns people might have. We like the idea of the technology, everybody's trying to incorporate it as appropriately as possible, but are we jumping into it too fast?
Well, it's definitely something that's been brought in, and now the questions are being developed. It's not a panacea to solve everything in the world, right? Mm-hmm. It's a tool that's been brought in that's brought up a bunch of questions, and quite frankly, it's kind of an exciting time because it's new technology, and it's a good way to make sure that the view of a police officer in a circumstance is actually seen instead of just being the words, the testimony of a police officer. But that brings up a million other questions about privacy rights and a bunch of other things, and even the officer's rights. What if they forget to turn it on in a case where they were supposed to? Do they get in trouble, right? Or what if it's on all the time? What about when they take a break? What if they go to the bathroom? What about all the officers' privacy rights as well?
And who sets the policies? Is it the chief of police? Is it the city? Is it the city council? Does everybody have a say? How does it work?
Well, in our agency, the policy is set by the chief of police, but he's also, as we're preparing the policy and stuff, he's also consulting with the union president for the Police Officers Association. The president gets to weigh in on that as far as some of the policy recommendations. Like Saul was saying, our department doesn't require the officer to have the camera on all the time, but policy does set limits that if the camera is activated in a situation, that the officer can't turn it off until that incident is over, so that you're not, for example, you go to a domestic violence situation that may turn into a use of force situation where an officer has to use force to effect the arrest. And if that's being filmed, that officer can't, by policy, turn that camera off.
But what if he inadvertently does that?
Well, the way our camera's set up, it's just not that simple to turn it off. There's the way the battery pack with the button is set up, you really have to give an effort to turn it off. So it's not something to say, oh, I bumped up against this and the camera went off. It's a little harder than that.
All right, very good. Jordan, we haven't heard from you yet. So we're hearing a good faith effort to try to get more visual of what's going on for the police officer. And yet, what's the other side of it for you?
Well, again, where I work, we have our camera systems, and we observe a person shoplift. And like I said before, when an officer does come in, they do have, like the officer was saying, they do have a choice in turning off or turning on the camera or leaving it off. If an officer does forget it, they also have an alternate route that I've seen, which is a recorder, and they record everything they say. So like again, they do have a choice, and I've spoke to a few police officers that I know, and they've said that they do have a choice as well.
I think the idea of surveillance isn't really that new nowadays. In these stores, people are being watched, and they have been watched for a long time. Yes. Do you ever get people who say, I didn't give you permission to watch me on camera, or people who disapprove with you having video of them?
Yes, I do get that a lot. Well, you walk into a store that's privately owned, we have the right to watch you on camera. When you walk into our store, there's a sign saying that you will be watched via CCTV. So we do have the right to watch that person, and we do have the right to detain them for shoplifting if they do shoplift.
Right, so they are watched essentially in these stores, but people don't like to be watched in the public. Do you know what I'm saying? So there's kind of that conflict.
And then, Will, you brought up earlier about the impact on incarceration of people of color. Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Well, and I'm glad you bring that up, and this is actually a really opportune time to talk about this. So I want to reference two really amazing pieces of journalism and scholarship done over the past 5 years. One is Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. The other is a more recent text by journalist Matt Taibbi called The Divide. Yes. And The Divide really sets out what Taibbi and others have called the parallel justice systems, or two different justice systems. One for those of us who are working class people, which ironically includes police officers themselves, and the other that includes the elites that run the show. And so this is a really opportune time to point that out. So all of these things that we're talking about amount to a surveillance camera and, let's say, an institutional coercive weapon pointed at one population, the working people and the racialized populations, African Americans, Latinos, undocumented folks, that is completely not leveraged toward our elites. I mean, our Eric Holder's Justice Department is now well known in bed with the most criminal banks on the planet. Refuses to call them into question, refuses to press criminal charges, and that continues with his replacement, by the way. Similarly, we don't talk about surveilling Wall Street. We don't talk about these kind of measures on those that are the highest criminals in our society. We do these things to control the poor. We do these things to control people who are at the bottom of society. So I think you are, in fact, quite right that our country in general is sick of being coerced and surveilled in light of the greatest criminals that walk among us walking with complete and total impunity. And here we are as working class people arguing over how to best surveil, coerce, and cage each other, while the financial elites and the political elite who really are, frankly, the cause of many of these vast inequalities and social problems go completely unobserved.
So very quickly, if you're called to somewhere here in Silicon Valley, and you might have the impression, or your officers, that the company or the corporation would not want that camera on, are you saying that you will still do what you have to do?
Yes, depending on what the circumstances are, our policy will dictate. If it's an enforcement type action where the officer is initiating activity, then our policy requires us to have the camera on. But if we're going there to answer a call for service because maybe they had an internal theft or something like that, discretion then comes in at that point. If you're reporting the crime, I may not record that conversation, but if you have an individual responsible for that theft detained and I go in to talk to that person, then I'm going to put the camera on that person because I want to record their statement if they confess to it, if they provide any other clues to other people involved in the crime or how they did the crime, or even from the standpoint, which is another issue, it's the protection also for the officer from any false claims of misconduct.
So money or power or influence will not determine whether that camera goes on or off, is what you're saying?
No, not at all. In fact, something that you were just talking about culturally and who's being surveilled and watched and caged, that's nothing new. That's happened since the sheriff of Nottingham back in Sherwood Forest, right? That's always been the feeling and the contention, and it's an interesting time now because it's kind of an equalizer. Technology is an equalizer, cameras are an equalizer, civil rights is an equalizer. So it's a very exciting and interesting time.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here, but you've opened up a wonderful topic that we should follow up on. But we thank you all for taking time to talk on this.
Thank you.
And we hope you come back for another edition of Equal Time.